Andreas Schwab, Dóra Dávid, Johnny Ryan. Welcome to Digital Markets Research Hub. Thank you very much for your availability. We will be discussing today the issues related to European digital markets and the new challenges and opportunities in 2025. So much is going on and so many trajectories are possible to address. And we are expected to look at these issues primarily through the prism of this kind of political documents, letter and Draghi reports. So perhaps we can start the first cycle with you, Andreas, highlighting your reflections about how much of guidance did you, as policymaker, get from these two reports?
Well, I think these both reports go in similar direction with a bit of a different wording. Maybe my general assessment of the letter report is that the title is a bit misleading because Europe is a great political community, but we are not yet a real market. And therefore, the title, which says more than a market, is a bit false. We should really try to get a real market. And for that, we should look for the best, the fairest, and the most open way to use the potential that we have. And therefore, I think that the Draghi report puts that a bit more concretely and a bit more straightforward. And digital plays an important role there, but also openness and fair markets. And that's a bit the combination that we want to achieve with the Digital Markets Act. And therefore, we have to work hard so that the Commission is really continuing the way that they have been starting in 2022 with the Digital Markets Act.
Thank you, Andreas. Dora, the same question to you, please.
Thank you. My takeaway was that it's a wake-up call. I mean, we all know that the main message was that we're severely lagging behind the US and China in terms of tech innovation. And what really resonated with me was when Draghi himself came to Strasbourg, to the European Parliament, and he said that, 20 years ago in Europe, the top industry was automotive, and it still is today, whereas in the US today, it's tech. So that's a wake-up call, and the reports also seem to echo a lot of concerns raised by SMEs around over-regulation and the regulatory complexity and regulatory burden, which hinders their ability to compete with non-European counterparts that may not be subject to such strict regulations. So, as policymakers, I think these are key takeaways for us to go into this new term and the regulatory agenda to try and simplify regulations and allow our companies and create the right ecosystem for them to compete and try and close this gap.
Thank you. That's quite a new kind of gloss popping up in the discussions, because that European Union has over-regulation. Do you agree, Johnny, with this, that we have too much, or maybe we have to be more selective or design new?
Let me get to that question by going through the first question you posed. Normally, people talk about the Leti and the Draghi reports together, but there's a third report by a former Finnish Prime Minister, Sauli Niinisto. I can't pronounce his name perfectly. Forgive me for my Irish pronunciation of his Finnish name. I suspect Irish people will be able to pronounce Finnish a lot better by the end of this decade. And that report is about preparing the Union for war. It's the military report. It's the civil preparedness report. Now, I'm not suggesting we're going to be at war any immediate moment soon, but what's become even clearer since the publication of the Letta and the Draghi report is that, we're in a moment where Europe is under severe pressure. And on the agenda, yes, there's competitiveness, which of course is a strategic strength that has a military element and it has a jobs element as well. But if you're assessing the benefit and the disadvantage of our regulatory posture, which we still have, I think you should take it through those three frames. You should include the security and the military frame as well as the market one and the innovation one. Now, I don't think it's controversial to suggest that you should cut red tape where it's useful. For example, if I were back working in an SME, an innovative SME, it would be incredibly useful to lower the barriers between member states that still exist and to allow me and my company to expand across the European market and to scale. That's still an absolutely crippling problem for SMEs. So yes, certain things should be cut. But at the same time, I was disappointed with the Draghi report that it was strong on what should go, but it was weak on how certain things could be used. When the GDPR was being negotiated, what the Americans said again and again is that this is a protectionist measure. Now, the way the GDPR was non-applied, because it wasn't really applied. The way it was applied, it was an anti-protectionist measure. It suppressed small business and local sports clubs across Europe, and it did nothing against the big players, nothing of substance. And what Draghi missed in that report is that there is a button just waiting to be pushed. It's a button for security. It's a button for society. It's also a button for competitiveness. And the button is forcing the Irish to apply the rules to the American and Chinese massive firms who've based themselves in Dublin. So short answer to your question is some things need to be cut and some things need to be used more.
And if looking at the misinterpretation or misenforcement of GDPR, I think the next wave of digital regulation, in particular the DMA, has learned a lesson, and we have it's much more centralized. Pretty much everything is in the hands of Digicomp and DigiConnect, which is much more promising in terms of more centralized enforcement and more coherent, holistic. So the enforcement scale is there, much less discrepancies and fragmentation. Do you see, Andreas, that the industrialization of European digital markets is a problem of scale? Should Europe try to meet the size of US and Chinese and maybe other big tech companies? Should we do it in our own way, or there is no other way? Maybe it's better to do it in the way which other jurisdictions are doing it.
Well, I think first of all, we should really consider also the ministry report that you were mentioning, that Johnny was mentioning. It is about making our societies resilient. Preparing for a moment where we would need to defend ourselves. And if we understand a bit how little the advance of the Ukrainians in technology is compared to the Russians, we know that we have 6 weeks ahead all the time. And why are the Ukrainians 6 weeks ahead all the time in technology? Because they are an open society which is using innovation as a key driving factor. And if you are opening a society, you can be better on innovation than compared with any other society which is closed and has rules that doesn't allow fair competition. So to be resilient in a difficult situation means that you have to do the utmost to be innovative, and innovative you can be best in an open society with fair markets. And therefore, we are the driving force for the European Union to work together, because this open market is composed of 27 member states that can all put their energy in it with all the businesses that there are. And we want to aim together for the best solutions for the problems ahead. If we can use these logics, I think we will be the winner all the time, even if we go through difficult times, because our manpower is there. Why, compared to the Americans as an example, or to the Chinese as another example, we are not making use full of our potential? It's because in the area of taxation, we still have member states' competences that hinders us to give the same investment opportunities, the same tax benefits for those that take a risk investing into specific tech companies. That's far more rewarding if you go to the US. But it's true that in the US, you have, in addition, also a much better way of societies to deal with failure. If you have messed up one company in the US, no problem, you start the next one. In Europe, it's considered a failure for the life, and therefore we have other elements as well. But I think more and more, all 27 member states, some of them a bit better, some of them a bit less, but in the end, all of them have understood that we have to improve this together, because together we are stronger. And on that basis, I think we have, doing now the job that is ahead of us, the best chances to acquire also more talent, because talent likes the lifestyle that we have in Europe, but also investment. If we manage well that combination of national tax systems together with the missing capital markets union. And in the end, it plays into that point that Johnny was mentioning. We have to make sure that we use all our untapped potential.
Dora, do we need European big tech, and should it be copied or developed in a European green federated or whatever the way, or the scale is not a must these days? And how do we reach how can we get this unification in terms of taxation? How can we scale up capital market? How we attract venture capital to the European industry in digital and beyond?
I think you're asking questions no one's been able to solve so far. But in terms of whether we should have our own big tech, I don't know whether we should try to replicate what the US has done. I think we're so behind. I'm not sure that will get us far ahead. I think it might be better to kind of strategically focus on our strengths and build on, for example, open source models rather than reinvent the wheel. So, for example, where we have strengths in health tech, biotech, and maybe focus on those fields and try and strategically invest in those and see what other measures can be put in place to encourage growth and innovation on those sectors that can then grow globally competitive players. And another point that actually, just piggybacking on what Andreas was saying in terms of what, are we comparing like with like in terms of the environment in the US and Europe and how conducive they are to growth? Yes, we have a very different tax environment here, which is clearly less attractive for companies. But we also have to acknowledge that we have a lot of values in Europe that we value, right? That is not the same in the US, and that also comes with a cost. So there is a trade-off here that we shouldn't forget about. But equally, I think we should leverage our strengths. So, for example, in the prior mandate, one of the big achievements was the Green Deal. So the challenge now is how do we achieve our green targets and help our, whilst not hindering competitiveness of our industries. And so maybe the answer is focusing on our energies on green tech and helping our industry there as well. So it's again a strategic focus on our strengths and values, I think, is the answer rather than copy pasting the US approach.
Thank you. Johnny?
I'm not sure we could even copy and paste the US approach without a completely free and open European digital market. It would just be, it's so difficult for consumer-facing companies to operate across borders. Let me suggest that there's two things really to be done and split them apart. In the medium term and longer term, it's clear we need to have infrastructure that we can depend on, obvious, and we don't really have that in the digital field. And the same goes for media. And these are issues that Andreas has worked on for a long time. We allowed such consolidation in those markets to occur over such a long time that we ended up with a few oligarchs who control them. And they're not our oligarchs. In fact, it turns out they're very much not our oligarchs. And even if they wanted to be, they're not allowed to be. And in the last month, we've seen that those oligarchs have to do business with the incoming Trump administration. So had we not allowed that to develop, that concentrated control over infrastructure, media, and so on, I don't think we would have had that vulnerability. Now, it's too late to undo that mistake, but as a project for the medium and longer term, that is clearly something that Europe needs to reflect on. A different approach to avoiding consolidated power, and a recognition that competition, and I'm going to quote a famous phrase, is not a side dish. Do you remember? Unfortunately for him, Olivier Gusson made this statement at Christina's conference that in his view, competition was a side dish. It was a kind of a technocratic space for the market. But actually, competition does not just serve efficient markets and growth, it also serves the preservation of democracy. That is now abundantly clear and undeniable. So there's a political change and also a change within the Commission required to really internalize that. But that's all in the medium and long term. Difficult things to do. In the short term, we may have a more immediate challenge. It appears to me, and I don't think I'm alone, that liberal democracy is under threat at this moment, and that it has been that threat has been rolling. What happened in Romania was a bit of a surprise, I think, to Brussels. Anyone who was looking at Moldova, that election right on a knife edge, mightn't have been so surprised, and yet the impact in Romania was so big it was a surprise. And now we see this rolling challenge over the last few months. Many European countries finding Musk, for example, directly intervening in their politics. So there's a longer term question about how you get European innovation back on track and how you avoid consolidation of power. But there's an immediate question, which is now we're in a mess, and what the hell are we going to do about it? You know, whenever that question is posed lately in the press, the answer is we have 1 or 2 DSA investigations, which are very narrow in their scope, actually. We have a few DSA investigations and they're trundling along. We have yet to hear that there is a coherent action plan for how we show that our rules in our market must be obeyed, and an understanding that market rules sometimes mean protecting the liberal democracy that we're used to. And a final thing to add to that is there's a chasm right now in the US within the MAGA movement, with the techno people on one side, the techno monarchists, to use their own language, and then on the other side, the economic populists. There is that chasm right now, but both of them oppose the idea of the regulatory state, which is actually one of Europe's biggest exports as an idea, that there is a rule of law and it applies in many domains. So on the one hand, it seems to me very clear that, you know, liberal democracy is at great hazard, and we are going to see these companies that we haven't constrained now being used to pick them apart. But on the other, even if that's too far-fetched, we are contending with people who have absolutely no respect or fear of the regulatory structures that we're relying on.
Let us move now to the issue of the Digital Markets Act. We have this paradigmatic legislation being in place, and Andreas, you're one of the founding parents of this new regime, and it is also based, if I remember correctly, this kind of historiographical discussions on the origins of the DMA, on several other attempts to bring the asymmetric legislation, which would be targeting, rather than targeting primarily small and medium-sized companies as one of side effects of GDPR, targeting only the selected list of gatekeepers. Yeah, I also know that the parliament doesn't wash the hands after the legislation has been adopted, but it is continuously engaged in the process of trying to somehow inform and support the Commission in its enforcement activities. What is your reflection on the first year of the DMA? Is it functioning as it should? Do we expect too much immediately from day one? Where are we now?
Well, everyone has probably his or her own expectations, but what we can see is that gatekeepers have already adapted their behavior a bit ahead of the schedule that was foreseen by the DMA. Some adaptations of their business models had already taken place before, and that there is now a huge potential for the European Union to apply the law in the right manner. Now, it's not a revolution, as we have already applied competition law before, and companies had to justify their behavior from the past. But the negative side with digital markets that are so fast moving was all the time that they have already gained all of the market, and only later they had to justify. And even with the even with the fine, they were winning much more money by changing the market structure compared to the fine that they had to incur. And therefore, we had to switch from an ex post evaluation to an ex ante ruling. And that's all. The rules are the same. Now, what we see is that the application of these rules is all the time relevant of some international trade relations. These companies have their establishment in China, Singapore, or in the US. And the application of the law is easy only in Europe. Because only in Europe, the law is right, and the law has the power, and not the power is right to apply the law. So we have the principle that the rule of law is a driver, but that's not the same in between sovereign nations, like between the European Union, in that case, as a supranational conglomerate, and China or the US. So we see ahead of the elections and the new presidential inauguration that there is some sort of doubts about the application of the law that have to be considered in a larger political context. And that is not what we want to see in a globalized world. We want to make sure that the law remains the law, whoever is the owner of a platform and whoever is the president of one of our strongest economic partners. And therefore, we had just this morning our session of the Digital Market Act workforce, the working group, and we will write a letter to the Commission that we expect the procedures to be driven in the same time frame as foreseen, respecting all the deadlines that are there by the law, but some of them being also indicative, to make sure that we can really untap, I will repeat that formula, the whole potential of an open digital market in the European Union. And there is time to act now, and I hope that the commissioners in charge have understood this fully.
Was your plan in, let's say, in 2023, did you anticipate, or 2022, did you anticipate so many non-compliance investigations being already in the pipeline? Is it more than anticipated intuitively, or kind of based on some impact assessment or other internal documents, less, about the same?
No, I expected a tougher enforcement. I expected also a faster application of the law. I expected also some fines already in 2023. And it's not about fining. It's about restoring order in the market. And if companies don't do it themselves, then fines are the only method for the authorities to make them respect the rules. So I think we are not seeing the full effects of the Digital Markets Act as it was foreseen. And if I may say that also with a view to Johnny and Dora, it's a bit the same with the DSA. We wanted to see a harder, a tougher enforcement of these rules in the very early stage. But now we should not complain, we should not be desperate. We have to push the Commission as an authority now to apply.
Thank you, Dora.
Yeah, so I mean, I wasn't involved. I'm not the grandfather of the DMA like Andreas is. So I'm new from the policy side, but I think the idea was to complement the ex post competition regime with ex ante regulation. And in theory, ex ante regulation should be faster path to compliance than ex post, prevention better than the cure idea. But in the case of the DMA, I think it is a little bit slower, but it's probably because the DMA was designed to capture a lot of existing practices and behaviors. A lot of competition cases against Google, Meta, Apple were formed the basis of many of the provisions. And so the path to compliance may therefore be slower when we're trying to address existing behaviors, as we're seeing with open investigations under the DMA against Google, Meta, Apple, for example, and then testing their compliance solutions against the provisions. But I think this is probably and hopefully a transitional period, because once these investigations are concluded, they will help in clarifying the right scope of the provisions and what is expected, and will ultimately induce the gatekeepers to, implement ex-ante compliance faster.
Johnny, you've been also feeding the discussion on the DMA, and your analysis, in particular in the Parliament and beyond in other venues, have steered and informed on many practices which have to be addressed. How do you evaluate the first year of the DMA enforcement?
I think that's an overly generous description of my role. And let me say, Dora, Andreas is the father, not the grandfather of the DMA. Look at that young man.
I'm sorry, I meant to
He's in
say
his prime.
godfather. Did I not say godfather?
Oh, maybe godfather. Yeah,
I said
heard
godfather,
Maybe
not
it's me.
grandfather.
It's my fault.
Johnny.
Anyway, I think we've got a bit of a problem of urgency, Olesh. We have a whole lot of tools in Europe, and we need to start using them as fast as possible. And I think if we haven't used them in the next half year, we may as well stop talking about them. Now, some of these tools, for example, the DMA has mechanisms where you can take very, very quick action if you have reason to. And the same goes for the DSA as well. I don't know if anyone remembers, there's a film called Zulu Dawn. And in Zulu Dawn, there's a whole lot of British redcoats who have, let's use the word invaded. They have invaded Zulu territory. And there's a line of musket men, and they are picking off this massive army of Zulu warriors who are about to tear them to shreds. And this is all working fine because they've modern muskets and the Zulus don't. So although they're very few, they will prevail. The problem is they don't have enough ammunition. And as they keep running out of ammunition, they run to the back of the line and they go to the quartermaster, who's a guy with a huge, huge mustache. And he says, "Where's your bit of paper saying you're entitled to more ammo?" And so more and more soldiers run out of ammo, approach that guy looking for ammo, which he has on a huge, huge crate. And he says, "Where's your paperwork?" And they say, "We just need the bullets right now." We are getting to a point where the terror of an annulment decision, which paralyzes in times of crisis, I fear, I suspect that's where we're coming, that the same fate may befall us that befell that army. They were wiped out. There's a certain point where you can no longer play, and I'm going to quote commission terms that come up again and again, the iterative, slow approach. Sometimes you're in a crisis, and when there's a crisis, you need to change what you're doing. And we saw that Europe could do that with energy. Look at that transition from Russian supply of energy. I see none of that. So the DMA was not, it seemed to me, used to its fullest at the earliest opportunity, nor was the DSA, nor was GDPR, nor was anything else of relevance, AVMSD, you name it. And now that we're in a crisis, maybe it'll speed up a little bit, but actually what we need is for it to speed up radically. And that means a change of mindset. So I'm not optimistic. I wish I could be, because this is really quite consequential.
The only Zulu movie I watched was Monty Python, but you probably refer to another one.
It's a similar scene.
The next question, following up on the things which have been said earlier. On one hand, so it looks to me like a dilemma. On one hand, the reliance on rule of law, and we know that strong defenders have very powerful economic and legal teams who can problematize the most innocent procedural element and extend and delay, and we have it with exposed. And it's not unlikely that something of this flavor will pop up with enforcement of the DMA cases, because we are talking, the stakes are high, fines are high, etc. One of the solutions supposedly is searching for a kind of amicable dialogue, regulatory dialogue, where the enforcers show their stick hanging on the wall peacefully, but which can be applied very quickly with kind of proactive means, but still trying to cut the corners and try to find a win-win solution. That's a participative approach, so to say. So I want to ask you, Andreas, as a co-legislator, you, Dora, as a co-legislator, but also who have the experience with working in big tech, you, Johnny, who also informed the discussion, but also have the experiences working in technology sector. Which of the processes appears to be more realistic? Should it be more adversarial one, or a more kind of less strict, but trying to find a win-win solution behind the doors, maybe even?
Well, first of all, we have to consider that we have to consider this also in a reflection of trade imbalances. We have with the Americans a trade surplus in relation to the trade of goods, but if we take the trade of goods and services, we have a negative trade imbalance. And this trade imbalance is growing, and therefore we have to consider this ahead of the inauguration of Trump in the US on Monday. Secondly, what we care about is compliance. We don't care about fines. We don't want to catch up the losses that European companies, not only European companies, by the way, have had with unfair behaviors, illegal behaviors of gatekeepers. But we want to make sure that compliance with the rules is ensured from now. In fact, from the start of the Digital Markets Act in 2023. So we have already lost a year in areas where they haven't complied. But if there is now some sort of solution that they say, we can respect the rules like this, and the Commission is happy for them in that exact manner to apply the rules, then it's a win-win situation. Is it likely to happen? No, because this is all about capitalism. These companies have a global shareholder value, and the shareholders are there to increase their values. And only, at least to a certain extent, only very clear decisions of regulators will make the shareholder value logic a reality, at the same time for the company to respect the law. Because if regulators are just discussing nicely, the pressure of the markets will not be there to be compliant. So we have to push for compliance, and then for making sure that there is a coherence of the market behavior of the companies with the law. And we can achieve this, but it's not only achievable from my point of view with negotiations, but also with a very strong stick that has to be used from time to time. And we can only encourage the Commission not to wait too long to do this.
Thank you. Dora?
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think compliance shouldn't be the subject of deal making. I think that's quite concerning. And that's why the trend that we're seeing in the US is concerning, because big tech clearly has the ear of the Trump administration. As long as the requirements of the law can achieve, there could be negotiation around what is the best way of achieving it. We don't want regulators to dictate the user experience. The companies know how their companies work, how their services work well, and what the most effective solutions can be. And there can be dialogue around what the best and most effective solutions could be between the company and the regulator. But the law, the aim and the objective of the law should still be achieved, and that should not be subject of transatlantic deal making, let's say. But I also agree. I mean that these companies are obviously for-profit companies, and so it helps to speak the language of business with them, and explain to them why compliance makes business sense. And it's not only to avoid fines, but I think more importantly, to avoid reputational damage and not to lose consumers and their trust. And the question is, which of the practices of these companies resonate and concern consumers? It may be different in the EU to the US. And there we come back to the whole trade imbalance question.
Thank you, Dora. Johnny?
I wonder if there is any reputational damage left. We've had so many scandals. I don't think reputation mattered for tobacco. I don't think it matters for tech. I do think there's clearly a political negotiation that will be done. And I fear that what Europe will do is it'll sacrifice digital regulation, which feels like a nice to have. It'll sacrifice that for security and for trade. I think there will be a much higher stakes negotiation where, for example, the question will be, where are you on China? Are you with us on China, us being America, or are you doing your own thing? Strategically, massive questions. But this idea of sacrificing digital regulation, I mean, in a way, we've already done it for a decade. There isn't much left to sacrifice, just like there isn't much reputation for the tech firms left to lose. We're starting from almost nowhere. So what I would like to see, Olish, I would like to see Europe have an off switch. If you don't accept the rules of our market, we can stop you being in our market. Now, we saw Albania decide legally we are kicking TikTok out of the Albanian market for 12 months and we'll reevaluate it afterwards. But once it had made that decision, now it's doing the technical work to figure out how to apply that. If we have a situation where these companies refuse, for example, to take any steps on child safety, it's something that Dora is working on right now. If they refuse to take the necessary steps relevant to the market, or if they refuse to fix the problems that their algorithmic recommender systems are causing, there must be a final, lever that Europe can pull. And I think step one is that the relevant authorities are requested to be technically prepared. Now, we never want to use that lever. You certainly don't want to switch off an information system that the public may rely on. That is not at all what anyone wants. But if the operators of that system continue to not respect European law, there has to be an ultimate consequence. And the ultimate consequence is, if you sell poisoned meat in the market, we stop letting your meat into the market because you're going to cause enormous harm. So step one is, what is Europe's ultimate sanction for the companies? And is it actually practical? And is it credible? Because right now, I don't think it is credible. And then step two is, where does data protection fit into all of this stuff? I mentioned earlier, the Americans were worried that it was a protectionist measure, and it turned out to be anything but. It was an act of self-harm because it wasn't applied in any meaningful way. It is time to actually apply that law properly, and that means pressure on Ireland. And again, the third thing is, if we're still reaching for these new tools, DSA and DMA, and not producing results 12 months from now, that actually change the power dynamic. And when I say power dynamic, I do mean between Europe and America, and between these firms and Europe. We should stop talking about them. I think we have a very, very short runway to use these tools. They are potentially very useful, but we have to actually use them.
Let me move a little bit to the title of Enrico Letta report, which Andreas referred to, much more than the market, and that it's an overstatement, because Europe is not a single market. Despite all the efforts, we are still not there, and for many obvious reasons, it's a very thorny journey. Andreas, when we talk about the sectors like AI, where having 27 is just a futile or too selfish, it's kind of it's similar what we have as regulatory competition. You've been promoting this idea of having kind of pan-European approach to these sensitive issues for quite a long time. At the same time, you sense the national interests, different member states channel their or signal that they are not they are reluctant to somehow to sacrifice, and it's not one-click option. How do you describe the state of affairs? Where are we now? What should be done? Is it feasible? And are you working on this?
Well, that's a very interesting question. I'd say that the most important step that we have to do when entering into these next phases of a deeper integration of European markets is that we all the time make sure that the 27 member states are kept together, because we cannot deny that there is some sort of different appreciation in relation to the Americans in France and Latvia. We cannot ignore that there is some different reflection on nuclear energy in Finland and in Austria. And on all these issues, we have to see that Europe will only be as strong as we manage to overcome these sometimes national, sometimes regional different point of views. And this is for sure a key task for the European Commission, which is the government of the European Union, but which is still composed of 27 commissioners from 27 member states. So this, I think, is the first most important question in relation to all the differences of appreciation of specific measures that there might be. So the Commission has to create unity in the European Union, where there is not all the time harmony on this unity. And secondly, that plays also out economically, because Germany is in the middle and it's the biggest country. France, Italy, Spain, Poland, Hungary. We have plenty of big countries around, and their politicians are looking all to acquire economic benefits for their companies, for their citizens. Politics is also about distributing state income in the right manner to make the society in the area of responsibility the best you can achieve. And so we have some, let's say, points of concern, of conflict that we have to manage best. And if we manage to overcome them, we can create a greater cooperation, a greater benefit in wealth return to everyone, but it will make the decision-making at national level a bit smaller and the decision-making at European level a bit bigger. And we have seen it with the Digital Markets Act that national competition authorities partly wanted to keep control, others wanted to give up control for different reasons. We have, I think, found quite a good way of solving this. But in other areas like the real market, for example, freedom to provide services, the establishment questions of cross-border working and posting of workers is still linked to all these questions that in the US, between the different member states that the United States have, is much less important. And therefore, we have to give a credit to the European Commission that wants to take that into consideration. But we all know, also Dora and myself, and we have seen it yesterday at the hearing that she had organized, in the end, every politician has a bit his or her own assessment of the situation, and everyone comes a bit to his or her own conclusions. And that's what we are discussing in the European Parliament, and where we try to find common ground.
Thank you, Dora.
I'm sorry, could you please repeat the question?
The question is, supposedly, single market, unified Europe is the means to achieve homogeneity and also scale in many sectors, including such as, for example, AI. Whereas if you have 27 different agendas, diversity is great, etc. But maybe a greater union, ever closer union, is the best strategy for Europe in these days to mature its resilience and maybe go beyond and becoming an even more ambitious player. Is it the case? And if yes, is it achievable? And if yes, how?
I mean, the Draghi and Letta reports also said, cautioned that we should complete the single market because that is one of the big achievements of the European Union, and it clearly would help our competitiveness. And still, obstacles exist. So yes, homogeneous economic conditions for our operators would be good, but this ties back into, I think, our earlier discussion around taxation questions that might be very difficult to solve because, of course, it's member state competence, and member states have their own interests. And I think there are still areas where that is unrealistic to harmonize. And I fear that, if we zoom out and look at the geopolitical situation, the far right parties are gaining ground across Europe, and I think that means that a centralized approach in a lot of questions is much less likely.
Thank you, Dora. Johnny?
I don't know. I don't have an answer.
Okay. Then I have specific question for all three of you.
But if you allow me, because Johnny was so short, I think it's also a bit understandable, and this should not be considered as a superficiality. As an Irishman, you are very close to the Americans geographically, but at the same time, you are a European in values and how regulation should be applied. And therefore, it's, I think, quite stunning, the different assessments that we have seen. Because imagine you are coming from a smaller member state close to the border to Ukraine, your consideration will be a bit more about how can we manage to stay in a secure environment and pay a bit more with our data on Meta and a bit more with our money on Apple, compared to someone who has, let's say, the impression that around his big island there is only water, and then there is the US coming. And this is not superficial. I think we have to understand that there are different appreciations from different regions in Europe, and we have all to combine that. But at the same time, this shall not impede the application of existing law. And that's the question that is ahead of us. And for that reason, I think we made some compromises already in the legislation. The Commission has some liberty and flexibility to apply it, but it can never mean to give up on the application of the law. If you allow me, Oles, to say this.
And this is perfectly leading us to the question. I have three questions for each of you individually. To the question I have for you, Andreas, referring to the role of the Parliament ex post, once the legislation is done, traditional classical the separation of power intuition suggests us that the role of the Parliament is done, and you have to wait for another opportunity to have your say, informed and etc. But it's not the case, and it was not always the case. It was never the case with the Parliament, who in the European Parliament, who contributes meaningfully and importantly to the existing legislation, with the DMA being a particular example. So I wanted to ask you to shed some light about which specific aspects, maybe technical aspects of the DMA enforcement or compliance are on the receiving greatest priority from the European Parliament DMA working group, maybe providing us some examples.
No, this is a delicate balance that we have to strike. On the one side, we have finalized the law, and it's now to be applied without our direct interference. But as the representatives of the citizens, we know exactly how the gatekeepers are still offering solutions that are not perfectly in line with the law. So what we want to do is to understand fully the reflection and the assessment of the authority, in that case, the European Commission. And we will be feeling free after to comment on this, but we will not create difficulties for the authorities to apply the law unilaterally, because that's their job. It's sometimes a bit difficult because to a certain extent, they have reflections within such a authority like the European Commission that are not really parallel to ours. But we have different roles, and everyone has then to concentrate on his or her own role. And we are there to speak out if we have the impression that the law has to be applied harsher, that the law has to be improved to be applied better. And we have to control the European Commission to do a good job. That's what we try, and that is not always easy to communicate about.
But do you think, and probably it's a little bit too subjective question, so please feel free to ignore it. Do you think that the Commission has this common vision about the DMA, the DMA enforcement team, or that it's still patchy and different groups and different maybe DG people from different DGs see it differently, or you communicate with the Commission as a single voice?
I think that the two teams that had to work together from the very beginning, because we didn't have enough resources for DG Comp alone, have managed to come to good terms to apply the law, even though the principle of Chinese walls, that is the principle in DG Comp, is not the same in a regulatory environment like DG Connect. So there are some differences, but I think these people try in a very professional manner to work very well together. At the next level of the cooperation within the European Commission at commissioners level, with the new structure between Vice President, Executive Vice President Henna Virkkunen and Executive Vice President Teresa Ribera, I think it's getting a bit more complicated because more structural agreements have to be found before moving on with decisions. We will have to monitor that further. They have started their job on 1st of December. Now we are the 15th of January. So there is still some time to adapt, but we ask them to adapt quickly because there is no time to be lost. Therefore, I would say they have to improve a lot, but they have the time still to show that it's about adapting to a new system.
Thank you, Andreas. Dora, the question to you is: you are one of those rare representatives who knows the substance of or the vision of the European member of the European Parliament, but also who has experience in working within big tech companies. And we colloquially perceive or attribute to them kind of demiurgical superpower. And one of the elements of this superpower is the ability to adapt to the letter of any legislation without providing meaningful compliance on one hand. On the other hand, they can somehow accommodate, maybe to some extent, the emerging European enthusiasm in terms of scale, and to channel to design their business models in a way which could include, at least partially, the broader pan-European interests. Do you sense, from your current role as an MEP, that there room for establishing such less maybe official but more effective links with big tech is there, or it should be rather adversarial only and only strict formalistic control, check and command, so to say, model?
I think the question is, what is our objective? If our objective is to achieve behavioral change, which it is, then I think regulatory dialogue is always more effective in the end than adversarial, and that results in a fine that they can just include as a cost of doing business. So I think if we truly want change, then I think dialogue is more helpful. I wanted to respond to Johnny's earlier comment around reputational damage. I do think there is still scope for reputational damage, and I do think these companies care, because we've seen in the past that, and the reason why is because, again, it translates into business, and business matters. And we saw in the past that advertisers boycotted Facebook and X, I think, when they introduced community notes, and that hurt the company. So I do think speaking the language of business and how this will hurt the business if they don't comply is usually what resonates. And I do think, just going back to my time when I worked at Meta, they did take compliance seriously. There were hundreds, if not thousands, of cross-functional teams globally working on trying to translate the requirements that seem simple to what are very complex systems. So I think there is a desire there. And actually, the good news is the Brussels effect, right? That our rules can be applied more broadly, because often it makes more business sense to just adopt the EU as the baseline. Now, is it enough? That's I'm not going to be the one to judge here, but I think. I think regulatory dialogue is the way to really push for and achieve change.
Thank you, Dora. Johnny, you are a headliner often, and this time it's The Guardian and your op-ed. I wanted to ask you maybe to provide the key messages of this paper and key takeaways.
I mean, the first one is no regulatory dialogue. Again, Andreas said it earlier, there's global shareholder value. Certainly take what you can get away with in Europe and spread it out across the world. I remember talking to someone who had been in a very, very senior position for one of the firms. And this person said, this person's job would have been to go and talk to heads of government. And this person said, the countries we were really worried about, only ever, and it's still the same today, Russia, Brazil, India, and sometimes Germany, because these people would suddenly do something and they'd actually do it. They wouldn't talk about it for a decade and then not do it, which is what Europe tends to do, even in its most famous law in this space. So I'm talking about the GDPR, the most hyped one anyway. What the article is saying, Olesh, what I was warning about is Europe's democracies are now subject to an attack. This is happening right in front of us. We saw Romania, I mentioned Moldova earlier, but look at what happened at the time we're speaking. We're about a week away from when Elon Musk on Monday last week, if I remember, on Monday, he put up a poll saying, should America intervene to free the British from their tyrannical government? Now, you may, and you may not, like Keir Starmer and his government, but they did win a Democratic landslide. So that's quite a statement. That was Monday. The same day, if I remember my chronology, he had retweeted a picture of Bill Gates meeting the Norwegian Prime Minister, which was a fake. And then on Wednesday, he had his interview with the candidate for AfD in Germany for the chancellorship. And in all cases, many more millions of people would have seen all of those posts he posted because he juiced the algorithm as soon as he arrived at Twitter. or shortly after it's been reported. Now, that's just 1 week, but that's not in isolation. And I think Europe is caught in a pincer movement. From the east, we see the Russian work in Moldova and in Romania and elsewhere. And from the west, we see attack after attack after attack and promotion of the far right in member state after member state. When in November, J.D. Vance, the vice president, the incoming vice president, warned in a podcast that if Musk were to be enforced against by the EU, within the EU, in its own territory, that the US might have to strangle NATO of funding, I think that was a warning we should have taken. And in speaking to Joe Rogan last week, Zuckerberg said, yeah, he fully has faith in Trump to protect US business, including against Europe, especially now that it's playing by his rules. We have a whole set of these companies that control what all of us see through our feeds and our children. And those companies are now servants of the incoming Trump administration. At the moment, this may not last, but at the moment, that administration has Europe in its sights. I mean, there's no doubt about that. So what the article is saying is, it right now looks like a proper crisis. In the early post-war years, and as fighting ended in some of the theaters of war in Europe after World War II, there was a moment when many, many countries could have gone communist. And I don't mean communist in the sense of socialist. I mean communist in the sense of Soviet communist. And large Western states, some of them were pretty close. France, for example. There was that moment of uncertainty. Will Europe be primarily democratic or will it not? I think if we don't take action, we are going to enter something like that, where we have the tools of the big tech platforms, which we have allowed to take over our media, fully controlled by someone who has an interest in picking apart our democratic order. And we don't have tools in effect. I mean, we have the tools, but they're not applied to stop that. So, Oleg, I'll wrap up by saying I had 3 recommendations. The first was either stop talking about the DSA or use it. We don't have time for this slow, steady, iterative, it'll eventually really make a big impact in 10 years approach. We have to have the Commission no longer talking about its minor victory against TikTok Lite. And we have to ask the Commission, why did it take the US State Attorneys General to uncover the incredible duplicity inside TikTok, by the way, which proves there's no point in having a regulatory dialogue. You have to hit these guys, get some respect and fear for the law, and then maybe talk. So we need a total change of approach on our current set of regulatory tools. The second of the 3 recommendations is finally force, through political action, Ireland to apply data law to break big tech's manipulation machine, because that machine is now pointed at our democracies, and this is existential. And the third point is, if those things fail, which they very well might, and you know, my training is as a historian, I think this will be the moment. Hopefully this doesn't make it into the history books because we managed to do the right thing, but I think it might be the moment that's in the history books. If all else fails, we need to be able to block these systems if they refuse to respect European law. We need to be able to switch them off. Europe needs an off switch, not to be used, but to be shown as a symbol to China, Russia, and the United States. You must respect our rules in our market. They're there for a good reason.
Thank you, Johnny. We finish our conversations with inviting all of you to provide some recommendations to students. Where do you see the missing elements in the jigsaw puzzle, which can be completed with fresh minds and fresh, enthusiasm coming from recent graduates? Andreas.
We have to fight for the values that we stand for, and not for the money that we may gain somewhere, or the money that some people can dispose about. We should care about logical and fair political positions, and we shouldn't believe that everyone who has money has fair political positions, and we should therefore act accordingly. And that demands a lot of personal commitment and engagement, which is needed to make our societies fairer and better. And everyone is invited to participate there.
Thank you, Andreas. Dóra?
I think a nice essay question would be this problem that we've just been talking about, foreign interference in European politics, using social media and online channels, and how can we tackle them, and is our existing toolkit enough or not? I think we had an interesting discussion on that, and it would make for a great essay question.
Thank you, Dóra. Johnny?
Well, I think writing a future scenario, maybe not that far in the future. And the essay question would be, why did the liberal state collapse? And why did the regulatory state fail?
Andreas Schwab, Dóra Dávid, Johnny Ryan, thank you very much for sharing your ideas with all of us.